good to see everyone, at least virtually. You know, as I said in my notes, I think we've got a lot on this December. You know, I think we're in a good place, but it's going to demand quite a lot of us and staff, I think, and we have to recognise that. So we've sort of designed the agenda with the appropriate breaks and also sequence things to try and keep things moving and so on. And we'll try and sort of you know, check in terms of where we are in process and so on to keep things moving. But I think, you know, we are in a good place, even although we've got a lot of work to do. In terms of just some housekeeping before we get moving in terms of the board meeting, we have with us as observers 2 of the 3 new board members for next year. So René Pichard, who most of you will know, and Hervé Adrien Metzger, who is Michel's successor from the Cour des Comptes in France. So they're both with us. Marie Kobayashi will join us next week. But René and Hervé are both with us to listen to the debate on a measurement, bearing in mind that if things go according to plan, then we anticipate a final wrap-up session on measurement in the February check-in. We do have a late apology from Mark. Unfortunately, there was a family emergency that he's having to take care of, so we're hopeful that he won't be with us today, but we hope he'll be back with us tomorrow. Only one other item of just administrative business, which is to say that Vanessa Mello, who you can see virtually on the screen at the moment, Vanessa supports the team in terms of administrative matters and acts as my PA for IPSASB matters. Vanessa will be writing out to all board members because we're at that time of year again, or approaching that time of year again, when we're looking at member appraisals. So we're going to try and fit those in during the 2nd week in January. So Vanessa will be contacting you about that. And if we can get those scheduled, that would be really helpful if you can respond to her. We'll try and do those over Zoom this time round. You know, please respond as soon as you can on that. Ross, I don't think there's anything else administrative. So then if we can move through then into item 1 on the agenda. And one of the major events, certainly in the IPSASB world, since we've last met, has been the publication of the Public Interest Committee governance review. So, you know, it's a very important milestone for the board, 5 years in terms of the new arrangements. And I'm delighted that we've got John Blondal, who is one of the co-chairs of the PIC from OECD. Many of you will know him very well from the Accrual Symposium, which is one of the big events in the calendar. John is joining us to present the results of the review, and then will be available for questions and discussion afterwards. So, John, I think you're with us. If you can put your camera on, and I think you'll be using slides, will you?
I will indeed.
Morning, John. Good to see you.
Good morning. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. This is rather low tech. I came into the office in order for this to be high tech, but I realized that I have, I think, higher technology at home than I do in the office. But it's let's start with the screen. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to present the results of the IPSASB, the review of the IPSASB oversight arrangements. I think the last time that I was with you was in New York, but I was one of the few people that was remote, and we come back later in the year, and I think we're all remote. So the world is changing, but we'll hopefully go back to normal. So let me just go right into it. I realize you're short on time. First of all, this was the 5th year anniversary of the Public Interest Committee. We have been in existence for 5 years. I'd like to, in this presentation, sort of 2 things, just to give a little bit of a background on the Public Interest Committee, and then go into the results of the recent public consultation exercise. I think when I was with you earlier, we were talking more about essentially the raw scores that had come out of the consultation exercise, whereas here our report, which is just out, is sort of more focused on the nuances that came in a commentary to the questions, and also in some of the subsequent conversation that the Public Interest Committee had with key stakeholders. So just to reiterate that we are new, that the IPSASB, or its predecessor, the Public Sector Committee, issued its first standard in 1997, as most of you will know, and it was not until 2015 that an oversight body, the Public Interest Committee, was created. So for most of the existence of the IPSASB and its predecessors, PSC, it operated without an oversight board, which is quite a tribute to the board that it went that long without an oversight board, which is unique among international standard setters. However, it had been raised as a concern that there was not an independent sort of formal oversight board, and that was viewed as one of the hesitancies that countries had for increasing the use of IPSAS, that there was not this formal oversight mechanism. So in May 2013, the IPSASB Governance Review Group was established, which was the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD. We went through a period of extensive public consultations between January and April 2014, which led to the recommendations to establish the Public Interest Committee. And the committee, the way it is today, is very much a reflection of those recommendations. They were implemented in full. Now, as you know, the membership of the Public Interest Committee is the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, and INTOSAI. 3 of these organizations are the ones that were on the IPSASB Governance Review Group, but one of its mandates was to search among all stakeholders interested in public interest oversight. So we had conversations with IOSCO, with the Financial Stability Board, with many organizations to get them involved in this. But we succeeded in getting INTOSAI on board. But I would just like to emphasize, because this was one of the questions in the review about the membership of the PIC, that it is very much an open door policy for organizations that are joining. And I think as a result of this review, we will be canvassing the interests of those same organizations again now after 5 years. Now, the oversight activities of the Public Interest Committee, we divide them into 3 pillars. One is rigorous due process for quality standards, qualified and inclusive appointments to the board, and relevant and timely standards. So if I will just quickly go through the major commentaries that we received in each of these areas, and sort of how the Public Interest Committee is responding to this. The exercise actually looked at those 3 areas. It also looked at the visibility of the Public Interest Committee, some of the structural issues, the mandate of the Public Interest Committee, the importance of public interest oversight, the membership of the PIC, as I mentioned, and the overall governance arrangements. And I will be briefly touching on some of these. But the overwhelming message of the report is positive. As we say in our report, the Public Interest Committee is pleased with the overwhelmingly positive results of the public consultation exercise. It is grateful for the confidence shown by respondents in its work. Those of you who have seen the survey, we asked on a series of questions people to rate us from a score of 1 to 5, 5 being the best, and it was the overwhelming majority scored us either at the top scores, 5 or next best 4 or 5. So it was very pleasant to see that. But if we go to the commentary, and nothing cannot be improved. On the operational issues, the first pillar, the rigorous due process for quality standards, the comment that came through, and I emphasize that for the vast majority of people, it was an extremely positive result. These are sort of the comments from the people who rated it lower. So I don't want us to sort of get stuck in the fact that we are focusing on these things that could be improved, whereas the overall result was so overwhelmingly positive. But when it came to the rigorous due process, was that rather than the present way of ascertaining due process as a single ex post event, once everything has been done, that the Public Interest Committee should be more involved in the due process at each stages of the development of the standards. Now, this is a very complicated matter, of course, and that the Public Interest Committee is also very cognizant of not wanting to get into the daily operations of the committee. And so we have agreed with the chairman to form a working group between the Public Interest Committee and the IPSASB Secretariat, the staff, on how best to carry this forward. This, of course, is a very contentious issue, the qualified and inclusive appointments. And there was a view expressed by some, and it was a view that was expressed strongly, surprisingly strongly in some cases, that less qualified members were being appointed to the board for inclusiveness purposes. Now, we as a committee firmly believe that there is no basis in fact for this assertion. We reiterate and we simply reiterate inclusiveness as a priority, and inclusiveness in all its dimensions. It is not just gender that inclusiveness refers to. We adopted as a committee a gradual approach to this inclusiveness agenda. It has been in place since day one. This did not come as a surprise to anyone. We recognized very much the importance of IFAC in developing and maintaining a pipeline of suitable candidates. That's why we took this gradual approach in order to identify that. And based on the ratings of members of IPSASB, this has been, I believe, very successful. The performance ratings overall of members has gone up during this period. So we are, as a committee, very pleased with our oversight of the impact that our oversight of the appointment process has had. I do realize there are, of course, difficult cases, but I'm talking about as a whole. And I reiterate again that the Public Interest Committee is not involved in each individual appointment. It is the process that at no point does a name of individuals for appointment come to the Public Interest Committee and we express a view on that individual. That does not happen. So I just want to reiterate that. When it comes to the next major pillar, which was relevant and timely standards, there was a concern expressed by, a vocal concern expressed by a small minority, but it's a very important minority, that some of these activities were infringing on the operational independence of the IPSASB in terms of selecting projects and establishing timeframes for projects. A second concern that was raised was that the Public Interest Committee reviews the strategy and the work program for an extended period of time, but that there are deviations made from this work program that the Public Interest Committee should also, and some of these major deviations should also be subject to oversight. Now, in this, I think it's important to sort of have explain sort of what the Public Interest Committee is doing here. I mean, when we talk about relevant and timely standards, in relevance, we are talking about a public sector focus. That is what we are focusing on. We are not anything more detailed than that. And when we refer to timeliness, we are simply talking about the volume of projects that the IPSASB has going on at any given time and the prioritization of those projects. So another way of saying this, it's rather than doing 10 projects that take X amount of time, do 5 projects at a time that'll result in standards in a more timely fashion. We do not sort of, and I emphasize this, as a committee, we do not get involved in the selection of specific projects. We have never set a time deadline for a project. It is in these general frameworks that we have, but it is clear that relevant and timely standards, that we view timely standards as very much in the public interest of having timely standards out. That is clear. But in terms of us setting a deadline for specific standards, that has not taken place, as this committee, as this board knows better than anyone. The last one here, and has to do with the overall governance arrangements. There are further things in the report, but there was a feeling that the governance reforms that were implemented as part of the review 5 years ago were good, but we could build on them and go further. And the specific concerns that were raised had to do with the funding of IPSASB and the appointment of IPSASB members. And this is quite clearly linked to the role of IFAC, its memberships, and the Forum of Firms. Now, these are issues that we are all very familiar with, and it is beyond the scope of the current review. We, however, felt that this was raised by a sufficient number of people to almost be, to develop into or be perceived as a trust issue. And we discussed at length the Public Interest Committee what we could do, as this was clearly beyond the scope of the current review, but we feel that this is a very important issue, of course. And we have noted to the president and the chair of IFAC that we are, as a committee, stand ready to engage in a discussion with them about extending the mandate of the Public Interest Committee to cover funding of IPSASB. This does not mean fundraising for IPSASB, but to have oversight of the fundraising for IPSASB. And again, this is just to put that in the same spotlight as the other things that it is I mentioned at the beginning that the board had operated without an oversight board in general for a very long period, and then issues were raised about that led to this. And now we see similar issues being raised in the area of funding, especially. So having an oversight arrangement for that is something that we simply put on the table and to be further discussed with IFAC and, of course, with you. And lastly, and I should, of course, have said this at the beginning, that we are very fortunate as a committee in the very good relations that we have with the IPSASB, with the chairman, the technical director, the staff, individual members of IPSASB, the chairman of the consultative advisory group in particular. We have very easygoing, frank discussions, and the same with the leadership of the International Federation of Accountants, that we all want the same thing and we're all striving for it. And I think we work very well together. So on behalf of the committee, I thank all of you very much for that. And I would be happy to try to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the presentation. And I think it's right to record the thanks of the board, both the present board, but also past board members, for the hard work that's gone in from the members of the Public Interest Committee over the last 5 years. That's very much appreciated. I think it's very important, as you said in your presentation. And I think we'd also like to thank you. And I think, you and Andrew in particular, for the hard work you put into you know, the operationalizing of the review and bringing it to a conclusion. I think it is a very important milestone, and I think certainly, you know, we are very much remain ready and committed to working with you, both in terms of the working group, but I think also in terms of working forward, you know, in terms of the other recommendations and exploring the issues around funding going forwards. I think you're right, that's important from a public interest perspective. So thank you both for the work to date and also for the review. So with that, open up for board members in terms of comments, questions to John. Yes, Rod, go ahead.
Thanks, Ian, and thank you, John, for that very positive presentation. I have an observation and also a suggestion. Colleagues, please forgive me if I provide a little bit of Canadian context in my observation and suggestion. I'm probably going to draw a little bit on that. My observation has to do with the importance of oversight committees. And when I think back in terms of the Canadian context, going back to the year 2000, 2001, I think of what happened with Enron and the breakdown in accounting standards, and how governments were looking at various accounting bodies and very concerned about what they were doing in Canada. Through that decade, to the financial meltdown at the end of the decade, the culmination in the Dodd-Frank Act, the whole area of accounting standards and whether they were meeting the public interest and really providing enough warning when these major meltdowns would occur. What really saved the Canadian standard setting function was really having an oversight committee. And governments, I believe, would have probably taken a fairly heavy hand compromising the independence of standard setting had it not been that Canada had an oversight committee that would provide a degree of independent overview. So I've always felt that oversight committees are extremely important from that protective independence perspective. And certainly when I chaired the Canadian Public Sector Board, I always felt that the Oversight Committee provided a very useful kind of independent perspective that gave us some protection from various parties and stakeholders that had concerns. So I just wanted to say that in terms of from a governance perspective. My suggestion is a little bit of a follow-on from that. Again, looking at oversight committees dealing with stakeholders and dealing with that kind of intermediation often between the standard setter and stakeholders. Certainly, again, in the Canadian context, we had a lot of that where we had sovereign entities who were concerned about many of the standards that we set. It seems to me that one element, and this is as much a consideration for James and Ian as John, you looked at operational issues, some governance issues, but to me, there's a whole strategic element that is very, very critical. And whenever one looks at a strategic perspective, you go back to, what are you trying to do? And basically, what this board is trying to do is to develop standards that will be used by entities, by governments around the world. So it has a global objective in terms of promulgation of standards. And I feel that having more information about that is very helpful, more board discussion on that, whether it's part of a director's report or some periodic kind of reporting, that would be very helpful. Again, let's use Canada as an example. Canada took a decision last March respecting international standards. I no longer chair that board. However, I'm always invited to its public engagement mechanism, and that's where there's discussion in front of the public. The board normally meets in private, but this is like a public discussion that happens. We had that discussion 2 weeks ago. We had a discussion on emerging issues. A big part of that emerging issues discussion had to do with what was happening at the international level and whether developments in areas like sustainability, climate responsibility, social kinds of issues, governance, the whole thing around sustainability that is being looked at by entities like the Sustainability Board, whether or not those kinds of developments are consistent with what's happening internationally. So as a board member on this board, and this is my last meeting, so I just throw this out, and certainly board members will have their own views on how they want to move forward. I would want to know if the decisions that I'm taking on this board are consistent with, not consistent with, have an impact on the capacity of countries to adopt standards. I'm not saying that should impact as how standards develop, but wouldn't you want to know that? Wouldn't you want to know that the decisions that you're making are going to have an impact on your fundamental objective of promulgating your standards worldwide? It seems to me that that would be pretty important. When I first joined this board, and I know I'm kind of going on a bit long, so I just finished with this. One of the things that I understood from the information that I had was that the European Union was very, very much focused on whether or not this board would develop a social benefit standard. So I went into the board knowing that, and knowing that it was very important for that to happen. So I think that kind of strategic information about what various stakeholders, what countries are looking to do, how the decisions that are taken at this board either support, don't support, get in the way of, or further that overall global objective, I think is very important. So how that sits between the Oversight Committee, reports at this board, that's, I guess, not my purview, again, being my last meeting, but I simply leave that as a comment. I think it's a very, very important strategic element that is worth consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. I think that's very useful context. I don't know if you want to react at all immediately, John. I would just say two things. One is, I think, Rod, to your point in terms of what's going on in the global landscape and standard setting and where we go in the future. Obviously, we've got the mid-period work program review that we're going to be working on, proposals during the first 6 months of next year. We have the first discussion during this board meeting, and then we'll be getting input from our stakeholders, hopefully through roundtable events and so on, second half of next year is the plan. One of the inputs to that will be the update that's going on in terms of the International Public Sector Accountability Index, which is being undertaken at the moment. It's one of the things that has run slower as a result of the pandemic, but we're aiming at the moment for an update for February, and that will look at what's the current situation 2020, but also projections forward for 2025 and 2030. So that's something that will be available to the board when we have a substantive discussion on the work programme in March. And we'll also be, obviously that will come into the discussion that we have with the Public Interest Committee. And the next formal meeting will certainly be March, unless we, we interact before that. John, I leapt in ahead of you. I don't know if there's anything you want to add before I go to Mike and then to Thomas.
Thank you very much for your very, very good comments, Rod.
Okay, so I'll go next to Mike, please.
Thank you, Chair. And John, thank you very much for your presentation, as well as not just the outcome of your work, but also the context around why it's important to have a Public Interest Committee. And I was very pleased, Rod, that you started off because you explained why that's important, and I agree with you. And I think your observations around strategy are also relevant, and Ian's going to pick those up. John, I had a couple of questions. If you're going to have a look at funding, is it the nature of the funding, or is it who provides the funding that is the issue? And if it's the latter, then I've got a conflict. And then I suppose my other question was, your presentation didn't refer to a paragraph in your report which talked about membership of your committee, and perhaps that should be broadened. And I suppose when I read that, I just offered a word of caution that you don't want to pinch people from the CAG, because that's what seemed to be, might be an outcome.
Thanks, Mike. Over to you, John.
It's on the funding, I mean, it's at a very early stage. We have not had any formal discussions yet with IFAC about this, so it is too early simply to make a comment on that. On the membership, it is most of the comments that we received about the membership was to broaden it to other organizations. It was not in terms of poaching individuals. So it was the IOSCO was frequently mentioned as sort of a proxy for the owners of government debt who had a great interest in this. That was the one that was most frequently mentioned. Others mentioned the Financial Stability Board, as we had talked about earlier, and others. A few commented on having credit rating agencies directly, but it was mainly the focus was on international organizations, and we are very cognizant not to steal people from the CAG.
Thanks, John. I'm sure that's a great relief to Thomas, and that gets you off on a good footing. Thomas, go ahead.
Definitely, I couldn't have had a better start. Thanks, John, for that. And I just want to return my appreciation of the great cooperation with the PIG. Thank you very much for that, John. I think so far it has always been a great discussion and very inspiring discussion when we had common meetings and I reported to PIG. So thank you very much for that. Actually, I wanted to kind of ask a follow-up question to Rod, and thank you, Rod, for the great comments you made, especially regarding the strategic perspective. And this is where I kind of just want to probably ask you, when we defined the CAG agenda structure, we deliberately kind of planned an ongoing agenda topic on implementation issues. It's exactly for that reason, which we explained, that we wanted to see the general readiness of governments to kind of take on board the standards or implement the standards and to identify kind of specific challenges with kind of accounting solutions proposed by the board. Did you kind of feel that going in the right direction? Is there anything we could improve from the CAG perspective in order to respond to what you just outlined?
John, back on that?
No, it's to Rod. Sorry, it's not to John.
Oh, sorry, Thomas.
I'm sorry, this is a question for me, Thomas?
Sure.
Oh,
yes.
No, I'm sorry. I thought I heard my name there. I apologize. I think I'm getting waylaid here with who's asking who what.
Okay, shall I repeat?
Yeah, so Thomas, do you want Rod's comment or do you want John's comment? I was sort of assuming that it was a question to John.
I think it was to Rod. He heard his name.
Actually, it was to Rod in responding to the comment he just made. If John has any views on that, I think that's appreciated as well. But I just wanted to react on what Rod just kind of outlined in terms of strategic importance and kind of the contribution of the CAG in that respect.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm just not used to being asked questions by other members of the group, so I just wasn't prepared for that. But thank you for that. I would say, from my perspective as a departing member, the CAG has been hugely beneficial in terms of its focus on public interest considerations. And I have always felt that's a critically important part of the discussions. And I've always found the reports back from the CAG immensely helpful. And I think the governance structure in terms of how the CAG interrelates to the board and the overall governance with the Public Interest Committee, I think that works very, very well. So I have nothing but, praise and great gratitude for the tremendous help that has been to me as a board member. So I don't really have anything beyond that, Thomas. I don't know if that's helpful, but that would certainly be my perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Rod.
Thanks, Rod. John, I don't know if you any further comments before I go to Adrienne. Okay, go ahead, Adrienne.
Hi, I was interested in John's comment on expanding the membership. And I think this is really just a comment rather than a question. I do think it's very important to be inclusive to the public financial sector. So yes, on government debt, and plus the issue that we ran into when we were looking at public financial instruments. I thought it would be useful if we had a bigger tent as regards consulting with central banks or with commentators who would be aware of the financial side. So I'd just like to, I don't know if the right word is support John's message or consideration of looking for a broader financially oriented membership, so that when we develop standards, they're relevant to the financial side of government, which I think can only become more important in the future. So thank you, John. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian. I mean, I think it does demonstrate what we've been trying to build, that as our standards get more used around the world, those links into the various different communities become more important. And certainly, I think, you know, we're looking to raise awareness with those different communities about our work and the relevance of that work to their work in terms of strengthening public financial management, financial sustainability, all those areas. And I think, you know, certainly the dialogue that we have with international organisations, for example, IMF encouraging balance sheet approaches to fiscal management and so on. World Bank, very active dialogue with at the moment. You know, I think all of those relationships become so much more important. And of course, you know, I think I would like to record our thanks as well for the support we get from OECD. I think that's, you know, another very important community. So all of these, I think come together, and then, if you like, the PIC is actually really overlooking that landscape. So the more we can get other organisations in, the better, I think. Okay, other questions then for John? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So John, perhaps we should just talk about sort of next steps, and obviously, you know, we'll really be looking very early next year, I think, in terms of implementing the working group and so on. Any other thoughts forward into 2021?
No, I mean, as sort of both the working group, which we are hoping, as you say, in the new year, we will be reaching out, James, to IFAC regarding the sort of the mandate question, and we are also sort of cognizant that you know, our in-person attendance at the IPSASB meetings has been uneven, and we're sort of hoping to remedy that in the future, so we can start observing more just in person. So it's but again, thank you very much, and I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you, John, and thanks once again for all the hard work on the review. Excellent, really appreciate it. Okay, good. So I think with that, then we have the other items, the other parts of item 1. We have 1.2, which is the formal approval of the September minutes. I don't know if there are any further points on those after circulation. Okay, so not seeing any hands raised, I think we formally approve those. We also have the minutes of the virtual check-in from October. Any points anybody wants to raise on those? Okay, so not seeing any hands raised, we approve those, which then brings us on to Thomas in terms of CAG updates. So if you'd like to head off on that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and I will be brief. I want to touch on 3 points in my update. First is a short report on the CAG update meeting, which we conducted for the first time. Second, a short reflection on the CAG meeting agenda for Monday, as Mike already alluded to. And thirdly, a short comment regarding CAG membership. Coming to the first point, the CAG update meeting. We did that at the 29th of October for the first time. And this CAG update meeting was already a promise in my, so to say, election speech to the CAG, because I found it really necessary and helpful to have an in-between meeting between our kind of June and December meetings, just having a short look and on what has happened at the March or September, respectively, respective meetings of the IPSASB. So my vision for those meetings was that we improve communications between CAG members. Secondly, we help members staying up to date with the IPSASB. And thirdly, outline to members the agenda for the next following CAG meeting, because many members just had the wish to have the opportunity to give inputs to the upcoming agenda for the next meeting. So as I said, in October, it was the first meeting of this type, and I think it was important for us to say, and thanks to staff for the great preparation of that, especially Dave and Ross, that this meeting was not meant to be an additional CAG meeting. So there was no preparation needed and expected for these meetings. It was there were no minutes prepared, and it is not meant to provide advice to the IPSASB. So that was very important for us to highlight that. We had three agenda topics for this meeting. First were insights from the CAG chair, from me, on the input and reflections of CAG discussion results. Second was an update from the IPSASB staff, and as said, third point was the overview of the December CAG agenda, and a short discussion of that. Regarding the first point, insights from the CAG chair, I alluded to 5 projects, which was the public sector specific financial instruments, leases, measurement, borrowing costs, and infrastructure. And all these 5 projects were always discussed from 3 perspectives. First, explaining the issues very shortly, briefly, to bring members up to speed. Secondly, summarize what was the CAG member advice we provided to the board in these projects. And thirdly, to just explain what was the IPSASB response. And I think for members, it was very important to understand how the results were reflected by the board, and where the CAG was able to make an impact and help progressing forward in discussions and decisions made. So this was very much appreciated by CAG members, as I can just report from first reactions I received. We will certainly have a discussion on Monday how members overall experienced this first meeting. The second agenda item was the update from IPSASB staff, and again, this was to keep CAG members up to speed and in important projects, and therefore Ross explained revenue and transfer expenses, natural resources, and measurement projects, and the intermediate results achieved, the status of the discussion, in order to help members to stay tuned with these important projects. And last but not least, the overview of the December CAG agenda. It was not the purpose to create a wish concert for CAG members, because obviously the agenda is set by the necessities of the board. And therefore this discussion or the preparation was introduced by just alluding to the project phase model as a basis. So highlighting where are the projects of the board, in which phase they are, and where are the point in time where CAG input is needed. So I think that brings me already to my second point, which is the agenda for Monday. And the agenda for Monday in general, on a very high level, focuses on 2 aspects from a technical or project perspective. First, revenue and transfer expenses, and secondly, natural resources. In discussion with the IPSAS board chair, we decided to focus for revenue and transfer expenses on very high-level discussion points for the moment, because this is what the board will need as an injection in their discussions, which is twofold. First of all, it's the structure of the standards or the guidance, as there were some comments on kind of the sequence of the EDs and whether there should be a reordering or a combination. So this will be the first point of discussion. And the second point will then be the kind of extensive requirements for disclosures in some of the EDs, and what of these requirements is really urgently needed and from a public sector or public interest perspective advisable. So these are the two aspects for revenue and transfer expenses. We all know that CAG members are very keen on having a more detailed and technical discussion. Some members more than others, probably. And we will kind of at the beginning introduce this agenda point by saying that they will have the opportunity to have this discussion, but not now, because this is not yet the point to kind of feed these results into the board discussion. The second agenda topic from a project perspective will be natural resources. And here again, it will be kind of an introductory discussion from a technical perspective, kind of guided by an example, going through the different points of creating kind of specific rights out of a sovereign right. And on that basis, have a discussion with the CAG members whether they kind of can confirm this example or have any other points of view regarding that. It will be like in brackets by the technical and program director's report at the beginning and the mid-period work plan review at the end of our CAG meeting. There the CAG will have the first opportunity to have some reflections on kind of projects to be taken on board and capacities being kind of, or resources being used in the future. So that's on the CAG agenda. And very short and last sentence on membership. Obviously, at the end of next year, so end of 2021, there will be the end of term for 15 members of the CAG. So you can understand that that is creating some challenges and some discussions. It will be 8 members ending their second term and 7 members ending their first term. And in that light, I think we have to discuss how to develop the CAG and the CAG membership forward. We started and had a very good discussion in the CAG membership panel call 27th of November, and I will report back some of the discussion results to the CAG first. And please understand that I want to do that first before I share it with you as the board. So Ian, back to you. That's my short summary.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. And I think that agenda is going to be very helpful for us as inputs to our discussions next week. Particularly, I think the revenue and transfer expenses discussion, that high level context, will be very helpful as we move those projects forward. You know, as members will have seen, we had a fantastic record level of response to those 3 EDs, more than 60 responses on each. So a lot of very rich material, but important to get that overview before we get down into that. So we look forward to those discussions and also to the context in terms of the work program as well. Okay, so with that, I think we move then to Ross. So item 2, the Programme and Technical Director's Report. Ross, if you want to introduce briefly.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. And I'll just highlight a couple items in the report, but my proposal would be that we defer the in-depth discussion on that report until the end of the meeting, giving a lot of the proposals in that report and discussion points will become more clear once we get through the meeting and whether we've achieved our goal of the various approvals we have. But a couple items to highlight for information, and if you haven't made your way through the report that I'm asking for in it, is the virtual check-in dates. So I've proposed what those virtual check-ins dates will be for all of 2021, so people can check their diaries and include those dates. And I'll highlight the first one February 25th, 2021, as a particularly important one. If we do achieve our goal in this meeting, that will be our final review of ED 77 and ED 76, should we get to approval. Also to note that if we don't need those dates as we progress through the year, we will cancel them. So we won't have a meeting for the sake of having a meeting. But so far, staff have found them very helpful. Although they do take a lot of effort to pull together, it is really useful in keeping projects on track while working virtually. It's good to have the touch point with the board on those items. Also, I've proposed an additional date to add to the March meeting. Again, because of its virtual nature, which is Tuesday, March 23rd. Again, if we do get through our approvals, we don't believe we'll need a great deal of additional time, but that final date to close off items, in particularly decisions and instructions, and lock those down is very helpful. So I would propose, if members can be available, that we extend that for the meeting date. And then there's a number of bits of information on approvals that I've put in there just to set out what the plan is for the approvals. But I think, again, in terms of process, the way we will be trying to work through ED 77 and ED 76 in particular, and we've designed the agenda in this fashion, is, we're starting our measurement discussions today and conceptual framework tomorrow, with the hope that we get through the papers that staff have developed on the key issues that we still need to land on those exposure drafts. So subject to board debate and agreement, we hope to leave with a list of subject twos. So for those who were on the board last year with revenue, you'll remember we had this sort of process where we looked at the EDs, developed some subject twos for staff to take away and further develop the ED drafting on specific areas, and then those were brought back for the board review. And we've actually designed the agenda so we'll have two kicks at the can on ED 77 and ED 78, with them coming back next week to review and hopefully move some of those subject twos off. And then we'll have on the final day of the meeting another opportunity to bring those back. So that will require some nimbleness by staff to take these away and develop them in between meetings. That means you might have staff reaching out to you if you had specific comments to make sure they're trying to clear it with you before it comes back to the board. So if you can, get back to staff responses on those two specific EDs, if you've made comments, that's very helpful. So I think those are the main items. And then on the final day, obviously we can discuss the work program and the theme B proposed projects of picking up IFRS 8 to replace IPSAS 18 reporting segments and IS 26. Again, that'll be dependent on whether we're actually in the position that we've approved everything and we have the available limited resources that we'd like to use for that. So I'd like to defer that debate until we're actually in the position to know the landscape better at the end of the meeting. So with that, Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Ross. So perhaps for now, just take any comments on either the check-in dates proposed for next year, or the sort of overall proposed flow for the meeting. No, okay, so I think that's fine. Just in terms of the meetings for next year, obviously the board took the decision that the March meeting would be virtual. We currently have the June meeting scheduled in for Toronto. Obviously, we'll keep plans for that under review, based on developments, particularly what seems to be, thankfully, some fairly rapid developments in terms of vaccines. But obviously, we recognise that we're going to end up with quite a differential picture next year. And I think our central scenario is that even should June be viable as a partial in-person meeting, we would need to plan that on the basis that it would be, if you like, a hybrid event. and we will need to sort of obviously have a look at arrangements going through next year. So we'll need to keep that those, you know, very much under review, really, in the way that we have done this year. But you know, I think more when things become slightly clearer. Yeah, Linda, you wanted to come in?
Thank you very much. Just on the virtual meetings and the check-ins, I guess we set aside the one we have set for early next year because it has a specific purpose. And perhaps we can discuss our experiences with the rest on the 15th, because I think, you know, I think it's very useful that these check-in meetings is feedback from staff rather than additional instructions to staff, because I think sometimes, you know, it was on an individual basis. So I think if we can agree kind of, well, the purpose of these is, as Roz said, it's more around, have we nailed the instructions, the decisions, and focusing on that, then getting new decisions and instructions. So it's kind of delineate between the purpose of these ones and the board meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Ross, if there's no other points. I mean, I think, you know, what we certainly have done is respond to a very rapidly, you know, complete change in operation this year. And I think it will be important, as you say, Lindy, to be more deliberate about how we're operating going forwards. And I think that's really the reason why Ross has sort of put those in as tentative at the moment. You know, and we'll review as we evolve operations during next year.
You've got a couple of hands.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you called me or not. I couldn't hear you. So
okay, maybe I was,
did you say my name?
Yeah, Rod, if you want to go ahead, and then I'll go to Lucy.
Oh, I'm sorry. It cut out. I don't mean to put James on the spot here, and I'll just talk for 10 seconds so that James can perhaps think a little bit about his perspectives on what's happening internationally around IFAC and, you know, as we move ahead through this pandemic and how things, I'm always interested in James' perspective on sort of the international scene, you know, where we are. I don't know if there's been more discussions on sustainability, but so I do apologize, James, for putting you on the spot, but if you do have a perspective you could share in terms of what you're seeing, I would certainly appreciate it.
Thanks, Rod. We can pick up on sustainability when we talk about the work programme. We certainly have got that on slides, but James, sort of what's going on in terms of IFAC's operations and the other two standard setting boards?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate, and this will be a spontaneous reaction, but we're talking a little bit about how we operate, Rod. I think that's your point in terms of how our organization's evolving and managing both now and in the future. And maybe I'd say the simple point, and I think it always bubbles down because we will, we as a board, but as all organizations, we're going to have a new skill set or a toolkit in our balance. And that is through the virtual, more nimble, more agile evolution of how we work. On the other hand, it's absolutely critical for a board with this mandate and the nature of the topics for the discussions to be in person and to have that level of engagement. Because I think that advances both the immediate outputs, but also I think our long-term balances, which is connectivity, which is influence, which is growth and development. So I think maybe a general comment is we're going to find new ways in which we will operate, but we have to keep in mind what brought us together in the first place and what value. So it's a general remark. What I would say, though, however, is as we go forward, I think the international impact is we have to be exceptionally mindful of the capacities of those that we draw into our community. So what I mean by that is when I think about operational issues, I think of the number of hours that we ask of our volunteers to contribute to our work. And I don't think we can take it for granted the some 400, 500 hours as we move forward. So I see the opportunity of a more balanced skill set is enabling our volunteers around our CAG. How do we continue to foster that? Is it physical? Is it a balance of virtual or other means? And around our board table, it's a very precious resource is our volunteer hours. So with that in mind, I think we're going to try and find new ways of balancing. The reason I say it's international is because I think all organizations are going to understand and ask themselves, why and what do we get out of our change? And the change I mean is the balance between physical, virtual, or other means of operating. So I just wanted to share that general reflection. It may not answer your question directly, but I appreciate the prompt. Rod, thank you very much, Ian, for the floor.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Lucy.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'm looking at the program, the work program, and I noticed that, for instance, for revenue, the quarter 3 is, well, that would be in June of 2021. It is still review of responses and the discussion of issues. Um, can we change this to discussion of issues and the discussion of the pronouncement? Because we already have 2 quarters for the discussion of issues, I'm sorry, review of responses and discussion of issues. Um, we have, based on our past meetings, we have been discussing the pronouncements prior to the approval. So the quarter prior to the approval. So for the June 2021, I suggest that we use discussion of issues bar pronouncement. And okay, for the conceptual framework, limited scope update phase 2 on September 2021, we are targeting to issue an ED. So I suggest that it should be colored, I mean, just to be consistent, to be colored blue. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lucy. Ross, back on Lucy's points.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy, for both those points. Yes, I can update June 2021. It should be review of responses and IPSASB, because we should be looking at a pronouncement by them. There'll probably have to be a review and update in March as well. We're developing, coming out of this meeting, a detailed plan to develop those final standards based on the responses. So I would say let's not focus too much on that date just yet, because I think we have to work through the issues we've heard in the responses and how we're going to address them and come up with a more fulsome plan that's realistic and objective. Not saying that's not right, but at the moment we've got a lot of responses to go through, and we'll talk about that more when we get to revenue and expenses. So we've never had this volume of response before, but I will make those changes immediately, and we will have to have another look in March overall. And thanks for the point on the missing blue on conceptual framework. I'll make sure to pick that up as well, Lucy.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you.
Okay. So not seeing any other hands raised. As you say, Ross, we'll come back and look at the issues around the work programme and whether we've got space for those limited scope projects back end of the week, or 2 weeks actually, isn't it? Sorry. So I think with that, then we move into the main item on the agenda for today, which is the ED77 measurement. And over to you, Dave, to start the ball rolling on that, please.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. Before I put the slides up and move into the coordinator's report, I thought I'd spend a minute or two doing a stock take or an update of where we are right now. The board really started looking at the responses to the measurement project and considering the conceptual framework limited scope update back in March. At that time, especially on the measurement side, we had identified about 10 themes. All of these themes were significant, and looking at to where we are now, we've moved through all those themes. We've addressed almost all of them. There's one or two that we're addressing in this meeting, and we've addressed all of IPSASB member instructions and come out with a number of decisions to this point. So I think we've made some very significant progress on this project. What we'll focus on today are, and I'll say throughout this week, but there's two big issues that we'll discuss. The first one is current service value. And reflecting on this last week, I don't necessarily think that current service value being one of the items that we're going to address today is overly surprising. And that's because this is a brand new measurement basis that the IPSASB is developing for the public sector, and trying to iron this out and figure out how this all works in practice, again, isn't overly surprising that we're trying to iron out the wrinkles right now. And then the second issue that we'll spend quite a bit of time on is value and use. And value and use has come back to the IPSASB a number of times. And for me, it really hit home in October when a member indicated or asked whether we were using the right tools to address a problem that we're trying to deal with at standards level. And I think where we've landed in December, and I don't want to steal any of John's thunder on this, is we've come up with a practical recommendation that really addresses the issues that we're trying to address. So with that, I'll move into the coordinator's report. And I won't spend a lot of time on this. Hopefully everyone can see this slide. This is the slide that, or you've seen iterations of this a number of times. I think what's really important about this slide is one of the major objectives of the measurement project was to provide constituents with more guidance on how to apply the commonly used measurement bases and where they would be applied in practice. And what this slide shows is it's a snapshot of what ED 77 is, and I think is a good illustration for constituents to really step back and see what the IPSASB, how the IPSASB views measurement working in the public sector. So I think in this regard, this really ticks off that box to addressing one of the major objectives of the project, because this didn't exist back in March, and this is a good illustration of how the IPSASB views public sector measurement. One of the aspects I did want to bring up as we move through this week, Ross mentioned 5 minutes ago that the way the agenda is set up, that we'll spend some time today on measurement conceptual framework tomorrow. Coming out of that, any subject twos that the IPSASB raises, staff will address offline and bring those back to the group later next week. We'll also update both EDs, and those will be brought back to the board in two ways. One, we'll bring them back in the current form, so I'll call it the editorial format, where we indicate where all the paragraphs have come from, all the changes we've made to them. And then we'll also provide the IPSASB with a version in ED format, so you can see what it looks like when it's going to be published. Those will be circulated offline. We'll discuss them next week when we come back on these issues. The last slide I wanted to go through on the coordinator's report before I stop for any questions or comments relates to two items. The first one is the communications plan that staff has come up with when these documents are released. So staff is proposing that all four related measurement suite of projects are released on the same day early in 2021, but they'll have different comment periods. And this is to alleviate, I guess, some of the overlap so that respondents can focus on responding to each of the exposure drafts. The only other point I want to make on this slide is in the top right box, I've indicated that staff is looking into virtual training for ED 76 and 77. From this perspective, what staff is considering is what kind of training we can provide in a virtual environment that will allow constituents to ask questions in a live environment so that staff can respond immediately, and hopefully that will help constituents understand the perspectives that we're putting forward. Finally, my final point on the coordinator's report is The plan for this meeting is to look for approval on ED 76 and ED 77. As Ross and Ian alluded to a few minutes ago, we will bring back in February, I think it's February 24th or 25th, the amendments to other standards as a result of ED 77. We didn't want to, well, we didn't have time to finalize those for this meeting because we need to work through the IPSASB decisions from the December meeting and how they impact the remaining IPSAS. There won't be other amendments to other IPSAS resulting from ED 76. Those will all flow through ED 77. So Chair, I'll stop here for a second if there's any comments or questions on the coordinator's report.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I think it's helpful to have that landscape. I don't want to tempt fate by discussing the detail of the consultation period at the moment. I think I'd like to come back to that once we've actually worked our way through the material and the proposals that you've made in terms of how we communicate with stakeholders. But I think that's helpful, but let's not discuss the detail on the periods at this stage. Any other questions or comments members want to make before we head into the material, technical material? Lindy.
Thank you. And I guess it's just a clarification for us as a board to understand the webinars and the training. It's actually just an education for individuals or institutions, organizations to understand, to prepare for comments, but it's not part of the due process. So any comments or questions raised wouldn't necessarily form part of the feedback that we would consider in once the comment period closes. So just that clarification. Thank you.
So my plan right now, I think, Linda, you're asking to some extent, are these virtual trainings similar to roundtables where we solicit feedback from constituents? I don't think, unless things change, I don't think we have a mechanism set up to take respondents' views in that way yet. So to your point, yes, I think these will just be ways to educate our constituents on the principles exposed in ED 76 and ED 77.
Okay, so thanks on that. I don't want to get further into the consultation process at the moment. And the only observation I would make is I think staff put a lot of effort into the revenue, into webinars and interaction on that. And actually the exhortation there has been precisely that this is not part of the due process, and therefore organisations should submit responses. And I think that's eventuated very well in that case. Mike and then Thomas.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dave. So Dave, I agree with you that current service value and value and use are two important issues we need to nail in the current days. I think as a board as a whole, my recollection is when we met in September, there was broad support for use of the term current service value, but I'm not sure we've defined it correctly. So I'm looking forward to the debate about that. I think an item that you didn't mention, Dave, was restrictions. I'm not sure. Thank you for dealing with restrictions in your papers, but I'm not sure you've landed it correctly for me. So I do want to discuss that as well.
We've got discussions ahead on both of those, so don't worry on that, Mike. Thomas.
Yeah, just very short and brief to kind of support the communications plan. I think the CAG at various occasions had kind of encouraged the board to have and staff to have a proper education, especially on interrelationships between the projects. I think this has worked out very properly, and I think certainly one reason for the record comments to the ED 70 to 72 was the good communication and especially the training to stakeholders provided during the comment period. So I really support the plan as outlined here by Dave.
Okay, thanks for that, Thomas. So I think with that, Dave, if you move us on then into the first substantive discussion for today.
So the first item that we will discuss today is current service value. And just a reminder on background as to why we've moved forward with this measurement basis is because when we developed the measurement consultation paper, one of the, I think it was a preliminary view that we put forward was that fair value, as defined by IFRS 13, the IASB, should be incorporated into IPSAS literature. Constituents strongly supported that, but they did offer hesitation, indicating that while fair value did work in some circumstances, financial instruments, for example, they didn't think that fair value worked across the board when measuring assets in the public sector. And there are two big cautions related to applying the concepts of highest and best use and measuring assets from a market participant's perspective when measuring an asset using fair value in the public sector. They indicated they just didn't think it worked very well. In addition to that, in incorporating fair value, we also removed market value from the conceptual framework, so that left a bigger hole that needed to be filled with a public sector measurement basis. So as a result, we moved forward with a few different names, but we've landed right now on current service value. And current service value is really trying to address these concerns raised by constituents and develop a public sector specific measurement basis. Now, the concerns raised by constituents, highest and best use and measurement from a market participant perspective, really relate to assets held for their operational capacity. So I don't know whether this helps, but when I was developing the guidance with the rest of the staff, the perspective we really thought of was this was probably going to be most applicable to property, plant, and equipment when it's being revalued on a regular basis. So as you go through the guidance, I think it's useful to keep that in the back of your mind on how this would work in practice. As Mike alluded to, the board has seen a version of this in September and October, so this is a third iteration. And we've, along the way, been addressing members' comments. We focused on 4 comments for the December meeting coming out of the October meeting. I wanted to touch on 2. The first was coming out of the October meeting, we put forward a principle, and the IPSASB seemed to be generally agreed that the principle worked, and they wanted staff to flesh that out a little more. So what we did was we've tightened the definition a lot, and aspects of the principle that were extraneous, we've pulled out of that definition and pulled into the supporting text. So an example of that is, I believe in the old definition, we included that you needed to measure current service value, assuming it's a modern equivalent asset. We thought that was too much for the definition, so we pulled that out and put that in the supporting text. The structure of the current service value appendix is the same as the structure as the other measurement basis we've developed in ED 77. The second point I wanted to make was, because this is a public sector measurement basis, we did really try to hammer home that you're trying to measure an asset based on the service potential that it's providing. And the reason we focused on service potential is because this is a characteristic of an asset identified in the IPSASB's conceptual framework. And because it is unique to the IPSASB's conceptual framework, we did want to maintain that in the definition of what's being measured in current service value. So a key distinction between fair value and current service value is that under fair value, you're trying to measure the value of, or measure the amount that you'd receive to sell an asset. Whereas for current service value, you're trying to measure the amount it would cost to replace the service provided by that asset. The 2 recommendations that we came up with were that the first one, this is based on the background, is current service value should be developed independently from other measurement bases that exist. So fair value and current cost from the IASB, and then also the definition that's proposed in the paper, that current service value is the estimated amount required to replace the service potential of an asset at the measurement date.
Thanks, Dave. So what I'd like to do is just take those 2 separately. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the first recommendation. Then I'm going to call the break for 10 minutes, and then we will get into the discussion on the proposed definition of current service value. So can I take anybody who disagrees with the staff recommendation in terms of the approach to the development of a public sector measurement basis, which we're calling current service value? Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands raised on that. Oh yeah, Todd, you object to that?
Thanks, Ian. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thanks. I agree that we want to develop the current service measurement basis independently from fair value. So we are wanting to come up with a specific public sector measurement basis here. And in looking at current service value, I can see some similarities to fair value, but it is an independent basis in its own right. So I'm happy with that. Maybe I will just stop there because I think we don't want to get into the more substantive comments around current service value, but I am happy that it is an independent basis.
Okay, thanks Todd for that confirmation. So I think I'm taking that the board's decision is, and I think this does summarise essentially the discussions we've had up until this point, but I think it's useful that we confirm that decision that we are developing this separate measurement basis to address the service potential. Okay, so with that decision, I'm going to call the break for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and then we'll start the discussion about the proposed definition of current service value. Okay, so David will keep time and back in 10 minutes, please. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming back promptly. So what I propose to do is I'll take a round of comments from those members who have concerns about the proposed definition from staff. Before we do that, what I'd like to stress is what I'm not looking for is detailed drafting changes at this stage. What I'm looking for is the areas of concern in terms of principle that members have with the approach that's been taken, and what your proposed alternative would be, because we are looking for solutions at this stage. We have had a number of discussions already, and I think the second thing I would say is I think staff have done their best to address the comments that members have made in the past. So I want to try and avoid going round this before. So if I can take a round of comments on principles that members disagree with and what their proposals would be instead. Okay, Todd, you want to go first?
Thanks, Ian. And this was something that I was toying raising before the break, but thought it was probably better to deal with that now. And it probably starts for me with whether we are clear about the objective that we have around this new measurement base. And it was in reading through the papers that, you know, we've got a definition for service value, but the way that we talked about service value a lot through the papers that I was reading, I think we're a little bit confused about what we mean by current service value, and that's the issue that I think we need to land on through the discussion today, because it does come across as a bit confused about exactly what we mean by current service value. I don't know whether it's so much an issue with the way that we've defined it as ways that we have described it in different places in the papers that don't, to me, line up with the way that we've defined it. And I think it's important that we actually understand what we mean by the way that we've defined it, because, as I say, because of the different views that are sort of coming through in other parts, I have the concern. So in my mind, if this really is about replacing the service potential of an asset, which seems to be the core of the way that we've defined it, I struggle with things like using an income approach to replace the service potential of an asset, because I think replacing the service potential of an asset is determined by what you need to essentially pay to be able to replace that asset. So there are a few things in there in terms of what I've described that, you know, we might need to unpick through the conversation, but it fundamentally comes back to, are we clear about the objective for what we're trying to do here? And I think broadly the definition, maybe with a few tweaks, is about right, but we need to make sure that we have a common understanding around what that definition means and the way it will be applied.
Okay, thanks, Todd. So then I've got Camira, Scott, and Patricia.
Thanks, Chair. First, I think this the proposed definition of service value is much better than the definition last time, because now we are removing, for instance, the reference to the modern equivalent asset, and so it's much more. So personally, I think it's much more appropriate now. However, I still have I'm struggling with not with the definition itself, but what we are. How we are interpreting the term service potential, because when you read through the papers, then how we are interpreting on service potential is like the current use, and that is my main concern, that might not reflect the value of the asset if we only focus on the current use as if it was the service potential. So then And the other point or suggestion will be, I don't know if the staff already, maybe you already thought about that, of including in the definition, not only limited to the asset, but also including the liabilities. Maybe to refer like, okay, if we are only focusing on entry values, then so at the end of the sentence, just also add and to incur liabilities at the measurement date or something like that, if it's possible. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kamira. So I've got Scott and then Patricia.
Thank you, Ian. Appreciate it. I do like the approach. I like the approach where we are now focusing on current service value and the service potential. If you think about what government's about, that's what it's all about. I wasn't really sure last time we talked about alignment with replacement costs. And when you get back into the back and reading the detail, I'm not sure we sort of figured all that out yet. Maybe it comes back to Todd, your point about, are we clear about where we are? I do like the definition actually in there about service potential. And I think if we just stay focused on that, I think we may confuse the constituents with bringing replacement back in the way we did. So that I did suggest a minor edit that I thought took care of that. You may view that as editorial, but I think we can eliminate the word replacement in the definition and it works. But anyway, that's my comment.
Okay, so thanks, Scott. That I've got Patricia and then Lynn.
Thank you. My question, I think it's the same in relation to the definition about the service, potential service. Because I think there is a strong assumption that the potential service of assets is it's a proxy of the potential value of service being provided. In the case of the example presented in the text, I think it's okay because the bridge provides the same service. It's a unique service to a possibility to move one side to other side. But I think when I try to apply the assumption in other cases, I think it's very complicated, and I think these make the measurement so complex. For example, in relation, the building as used for education services. In the case, the allocation of depreciation is part of the value. I think not the value, it's part of the cost of the service delivered. And then my view, it's so a strong assumption to indicate the potential service of assets as the proxy of the value of service. And it's very difficult to measure the value of service provided by the public sector. Consequently, considering the assumption, it's possible to use the income approach, but income approach depends on identify the cash flows or income and expense, the value of service. And I think it's in the literature, IPSASB literature, we don't measurement the value of service. I think it's a new in the literature. When I analyze before this paper, when I analyze, I assume the assumption that the measurement it's less complex. I think the modern equivalent assets brings complexity, but the thing it focuses on the potential service of assets, not the service that the entity can provide with the use of the assets. Considering that, my view is the approach should be focused on the replace the potential assets. For example, the building, the potential service of the building is a physical space. And then I need to focus on the replace the physical space, and not for example, education service provide use it the physical space. It focuses on the assets, not when how entity uses the assets. Consequently, the measurement become less complex because you focus on the attributes of assets, and consequently, my view is that the more probably is the market and the cost approach. Yes, it's my and other point is at measurement, at a measurement date. When I consider it at measurement date, think about the long-term use of the assets. I think it's not coherent because I need to focus on how I can replace the potential service, for example, physical space at moment, not considering what the entity can do in long term with the assets. It is. I think it's the I think the definition is okay, but the interpretation, I'm not comfortable with this because it became the measurement so complex. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. So a number of good points there. Lynn, over to you.
So I think everybody that's spoken so far has said, by and large, they're happy with the definition. Where it then becomes difficult is, A, has that definition been applied consistently in the papers? And I think there's some question marks that people might want to raise there. And also, is it then complex in practice? And I guess my points on that are, I think it is complex to apply in practice, and we need to help our readers and constituents apply it appropriately in practice. And I think some of the papers sort of say, well, it's a matter for professional judgment with the valuers, but actually I don't think we are doing enough to help our constituents apply it consistently in practice when we come into the detail. I don't agree with Todd. I think I can imagine when an income approach might be appropriate, but we can debate that. That's not about the definition. I could see that the income approach could be appropriate. And I think the other thing that does strike me when we refer to service potential, I don't think we're quite clear about, is it an individual asset level or a group of asset levels? And what about if there's a difference when you look at a group of assets versus looking at an individual asset? So I think sometimes in the papers we are too rigid or simplistic in our examples. So we talk about one school, and is it a 500 pupil school or a 300 pupil school? Whereas you're more likely, one might argue, to be looking at the education service and what pattern of assets do I need for an education service, and then how do I then identify this individual asset? So I think that comes back to Patricia's point, which is I agree with the definition. I think it's quite difficult to apply it in practice. I'm happy to stick with the definition, but we really need to be consistent how we use it in our literature, and maybe we need more illustrative examples or better wording so that it gets consistently applied.
Thanks, Lynn. So, Todd, I'm going to hold your comment for the moment, if I may, because I think I'm going to take where I think the issues are that are emerging from that first round of comments. And I think the jump-off point is Lynn's final comment, but other members have made this, and I think actually it was your opening comment, Todd, as well, which is there is inconsistency in the way that we've described user definition through the sections. So I think the first instruction from the board is that let's land some of the other issues, but wherever we land, it needs to be applied entirely consistently throughout. I think the points you raised, Lynn, there in terms of the application in practice, I think we probably need to think about those a little more as we go through, and let's have a look at the appendix on this in particular, and say what more do we think we need there. There may also be, and I'll come back to Dave in a minute, but Dave and David may want to say something about how do we approach this application, this general application point. In terms of the sort of specifics, and I'll get Dave, you to respond to this in a minute before we then go for a second round of comments. I hear concern, and I think that was well explained by Patricia, but I think came through in others' comments about the use of the term services, current service. That does seem to be causing some confusion. I think the original intention was something around this is using, this is the asset as used for the current service, but the service term seems to be providing, causing some problems in understanding. And it may be that we need to use something like current use or something like that. I think I also heard concern in the definition about, this sort of replacement versus service potential. I think that was sort of causing some concern, and I think the service potential bit was behind the concern that Camira raised, which was, essentially, I think the understanding is that we are trying to address the operational capacity, current service, current use, not to try and build in, potential other uses through this. So we need to address that, I think. And we do need to keep this to, I think, going back to Camira's point, I think we have to keep this to asset at the moment. Liability is something separate. So let's keep this focused, again, thinking about trying to provide clarity for our constituents. So Dave, I think just any observations from you on that point about the term service, and also about the point about service potential, and then I'll go and take further comments. So maybe Dave, you first, and then I'll go back round then.
So maybe just to emphasize your point you were making, and it hit home for me when Patricia was speaking, and it's something we discussed about internally, and maybe this came through the papers a little, and it shouldn't have really. But Patricia, you mentioned that in accounting, we don't really value the service, we value the asset. And we talked about that, and I agree with that. So maybe the clarity that needs to come through, and this is, I think Ian said it in a good way, we're not trying to focus on valuing the service, but we're trying to focus on valuing the asset, providing the service it currently provides. And maybe that goes back to Ian's point on current use. So if that helps, I think that's a good clarification.
Okay. Any thoughts on the other points in terms of the service potential point? Because I think that was certainly, that was certainly behind Camira's comment. Before I go to members again, Dave.
I don't have any strong views. Like I said, the reason we use service potential is we're trying to align with a term that's used in the conceptual framework that's specific to the public sector. So I thought it was important to maintain that. My initial gut reaction would be, I think we should try to maintain that term, but maybe explain it better in the subsequent paragraphs. But I'm happy to other views, but that would be my initial reaction.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I'll take second round of comments. So I have Todd first, and then Lindy, and then Mike.
Thanks, Ian. And I think Dave might have covered one of the points that I wanted to raise sort of in reaction to some of the first round of comments, because I think it's really important that we're not trying to value the service here. We are trying to value an asset. And I think, you know, the way that we have currently defined current service value tends to work for me around, you know, we are trying to value an asset, but it's replacing the service potential of that asset that we're interested in. So that's the basis for measuring the asset under the current service value. It's replacing the service potential of the asset. And, you know, coming back to that, and, you know, Lynn, maybe you and I need to have a bit of a debate about the income approach and whether that can actually be used to replace the service potential of an asset. I think in my mind it would be coincidental if cash flows actually get you to a point where you're coming up with the number, you know, the amount for replacing the service potential of an asset. Cash flows tend to, in my mind, work better for a fair value type measure than what I understand by a current service value measure.
Okay, thanks, Todd. So I've got Lindy next, then Mike, then Lynn, then Adrian.
Thank you. And my comment is around what Dave said in his last intervention, was that we're valuing the asset and not the service. And I think that needs to come out a lot clearly. And what's interesting is just listening to Todd, I have a different view in looking at the definition, in that the way it's written, if we're replacing the service potential, we're looking at valuing the service. And that's how I see it. So I do wonder, even if the definition is appropriate, the way it's written, it's fine, but then we need to clarify what we intend, because I look at it and I say, well, we're looking at the service potential, which is the services, not necessarily the asset. But I think it's a clarification that needs to come out quite strong in defining what current service value is, because you can easily think, just looking at this, you're looking at an impairment type of test, which it's not supposed to be. It's looking just at the asset, the way it's currently being used and utilized for, etc. So thanks, that was just my comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. So I've got Mike, then Lynn, then Adrian. So Mike, to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So I suppose I'm really pleased that we had a conversation with Patricia around, are we valuing the service or are we valuing the asset? I think we're valuing the service potential of the asset. I don't know how you can value the service, the value of the service that's being provided by that asset. So Lindy, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think it's, and maybe that's why we need some examples to explain what we're trying to get at. So let's have some examples that make that very clear, which are not there at the moment, I don't think. And the other word that I think has popped up a few times as we've had this discussion was, are we valuing the existing service potential or the current service potential? I think maybe the word existing or current should go in before the word service.
Thanks, Mike. Lynn and Adrian.
So I was going to observe that actually where we're getting ourselves, well, this conversation is a helpful clarification that I think we're saying is the current service potential of the current asset, and then you look for a measurement that gives you a replacement of that current service potential of the current asset, provided that the current service potential of the current asset is one that you want to replace. Because I think elsewhere in the papers, when we have the examples, we're saying if your current service potential of your current asset is more than you'd actually want to replace, then you wouldn't value that excess because you wouldn't replace with that excess. I think that's what we're saying, and maybe we need to land that much more clearly in an impairment consideration. I don't know. Maybe we're trying to do too much. But the point I was also going to make is we don't define service potential in the measurement ED, and we certainly don't comment on how we're interpreting service potential when it comes to this measurement. And I think we could usefully do that so that we don't confuse, that we provide additional clarity on that. Maybe what Mike has suggested about adding the word current before service potential does that. But when most people think about service potential, they think about the objectives of the entity, which takes you into services rather than the service potential of this asset. So I wonder if we ought to define or explain service potential better in the measurement ED.
Thanks, Lynn. Adrienne?
So my comment is more general. It's not only about service potential. So if you tell me you want to restrict this to service potential, come back to me, or may I go ahead?
No, go ahead, Adrienne.
So I liked very much what Dave has done in developing these treatments, and I'm not expert enough to have the issues that the others have on service potential, but I continue to ask my big question that I asked the last time, which is if post-COVID governments are going to have to sell assets in an exceptionally depressed market, how is this going to be dealt with? And I know we raised this the last time, but I come back to the new draft that we have now, and I think I would go to this draft on measurement. I would look for guidance on the appropriate measurement of selling assets post-COVID, and I wouldn't find it. And neither of the treatments, the value in use or the service potential, confronts this issue. So my question to Dave would be, where would one go to find appropriate guidance, and why is it not here? Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. Well, I think the point back on that is actually that where you would go to find guidance is in ED 79 on that. I think we're dealing with something different here. There probably is something in terms of the communication around which standard are we using in which context, but this is for assets that you're actually continuing to use. Where you can dispose of an asset, that's going to be in ED 79. So I think here we're talking about this as a valuation basis. Now, I think where we get to is I'm hearing support for service potential of an asset. So what we're saying is it's the asset and the service potential. And I think Lynn's point then comes in, which is actually where have we defined described service potential elsewhere, or do we need that brought in here so that we get absolute clarity about what we mean about service potential? I think my point though, around calling it current service value, that doesn't feel as though that's helpful, and therefore perhaps the proposal in terms of taking this particular definition forward is that perhaps it needs to be, we need to be talking about current use, but also to leave that service potential reference in with appropriate additional description or definition, and I think that's for staff to take away. But I think we need to replace the term current service, the service term, because that clearly is causing confusion. My proposal at the moment, and we may need to just work this through, is perhaps we just use current use to emphasize it's the asset, it's the operational current use. I'll take comments from Todd and then Mike, and then go back to Dave at that stage. So Todd.
Just on the back of, I think it was Lynn's comment, I just want to register something that I think we do need to come back. We may not need to discuss it now, but I think it's an important point. And I think, Lynn, you talked about something around if you would replace that asset, or if you would replace, the asset in full. And I think we do need to think about this, because an example that I sort of think of around this is if I am a public sector entity that owns a central city building, and I own that because I have all of my head office staff working from that building, and they occupy, say, 50% of it. And if I was going to replace that building that I owned, I would probably build a slightly smaller building because I would never need to use all of the capacity of that building. How should we be valuing it under a current service value? And I don't know whether I would be happy to value it based on replacing it with a smaller building, because you've got service potential in that building as it is, and you can probably earn revenue off the part of the building that you're not using by leasing it out to others. So I think there is a discussion to be had around, if we're going to apply current service value to an example like that, what we actually mean by current service value. Would we actually be putting a smaller value on that building than really the market value that would be applicable? But we don't need to discuss that now, but it is something that we will have to come back with as we get into the way that we define and explain current service value, I think.
I think you're right, Todd. I think it probably comes back to Lynn's point about let's have a look at what we've got in the appendix on this in terms of how much guidance can we provide on the principles and how much do we stray into valuation literature, and clearly we can't do that. And I think there may well be something in terms of the communication that goes alongside this, because we do have to avoid straying into valuation standards. We'll probably ask David, actually I'll go back to Dave on the detail of what we're proposing, but I'll ask David if you can come in based on the work that I know you've done with the valuation profession, in terms of how far we can go on the application side. Mike, I'll take final comment from Lynn, and then I'm going back to Dave and David at that stage for responses. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So it was just your suggestion that maybe we change it to talk about the current use of the asset rather than the service potential of the asset. Just a word of caution, you don't want to then introduce the possibility that the definition includes both assets held for their operational and financial capacity, because the use could be different, or could be both, or one or the other. I'm just not sure about dropping the word service potential.
Well, no, I wasn't suggesting dropping the wording service potential. I was saying that service, so using current service, is clearly causing problems. And therefore, if we use current use, and then the rest of the definition then focuses on replacing the service potential of an asset, that actually, with the clarifications around service potential that Lynn proposed, that you've then got, we're focusing on the asset in its current use. So we're not, I can use it for a supermarket rather than a school or anything like that. It's current use, and we're valuing service potential, which also allows the guidance that we've got later on modern equivalent assets and things like that. So it's aiming at bridging those positions. Lynn.
So I just wanted to pick up on the point about straying into valuers and valuers technique valuation techniques territory. I think we're a long way from straying into that. And the reason why I say that is that actually, from my perspective, we need to, within our standards, provide enough clarity so that organizations can instruct their valuers that the modern equivalent asset or the asset that I want to replace has this service potential. And at the moment, so I don't think we're anywhere near straying into valuation territory, but we do need clarity and consistency in our standards as to what we mean by service potential, so that organizations can instruct and receive consistent valuations.
Thanks, Ed. I think the two issues are separate, though. I think defining service potential is one thing. I think how far we go in terms of how do you approach certain situations is another thing. So I'm going to ask David to come back in on that because of, you know, working with evaluation professions. So if I can just go to Dave on definition first, and then I'll go to David for comments on the how far we can go. Dave first.
So with definition, I'm happy to take comments into consideration and rework the definition. I think it's been helpful to focus on use. And I'll even consider a new term for current service cost as well. I'm happy for suggestions. I'm happy to take current use as well. On, I'll call it excess capacity, I'll defer to David because we've just been messaging behind the scenes on where to deal with this, and he has a view, so I'll let him speak to that.
Okay, thanks. David, can I pull you in at this point to respond to?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Lynn's actually right, I think, in as much as that this is an issue of what is currently a lack of understanding and communication between the accountants and the valuers. I mean, if you pick up on Todd's example, I mean, what a valuer would tend to do is, if it's an ordinary office building, they'd be looking at market inputs anyway to value it. So there's that. But if you said, well, I only need half the office, what you would then say is, you know, to the valuer, well, I'm looking at, either I'm going to look at downsizing, if you could, or you'd actually say, I can generate income from this. And so actually the valuer will look at valuing that asset with its surplus space. And then it would be up to the entity to determine what they did with it. So I think, I mean, I can see the need to put in some additional guidance, but I think I would, well, you know my views, I think every board member knows my views on examples. They can be dangerous because people start interpreting them as rules. And so if we can actually find a way of explaining this in words, I think that would be a lot better. But it does go back, as I'll repeat it, it goes back to the need for the valuer and the accountant to understand each other's needs. The accountant needs to know how to instruct the valuer, and the accountant needs to have enough information or enough knowledge to understand the report that the valuer produces.
Okay, thank you, David. I think that's helpful. So I think responding to that, then probably the instruction to staff, and I think, David, with your help, is we need to have a look at the material we've got to see if we can provide further clarity on the approach that needs to, in terms of the way you think about these things as an accountant commissioning valuations. So the question is, I think, consistent with the approach that we've taken on ED 78, in the appendix on, and let's call it current use value for the time being, that should, we just need to think, do we provide some more direction there? Also, what are the options in terms of implementation guidance, perhaps? on specific issues. Again, not treading though on the consistent with the valuation, but not getting into international valuation standards. Just concerned on that. David, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I was just going to say, of course, we have got a valuer on our task force. So what we'll be able to do is quickly pass anything past him to make sure, because the valuers themselves are very keen that we get over this lack of understanding between the two professions. So we should be able to get some help from them too.
Okay, thanks, David. I think that's helpful. So I think we need, you know, that consideration specifically, and how far can we go without sort of ending up with problems with the valuation guidance. Lindy, and then I'll sum up where I think we've got to.
Thank you. And just on the excess capacity discussion, just a caution, because there are examples in the ED where we talk about a school, and if we're happy, well, the school can take more kids, but we're happy that we can only accommodate so many kids, we only value which is currently being used. We don't consider, well, we could lease out part of it. So I do worry that, you know, any excess capacity, you could consider the potential relating to that, because I don't think that's the intention of this model. You're looking at how it's currently being used. You can include additional capacity because you have to address the demands of the service in the long term, but I don't think you consider an equivalent or alternative use in valuing this under this model. And I think we just need to be clear, because we might be crossing into, you know, the approach under fair value, but that's not what we envisage here.
Thanks, Lindy. So summing up what I think has been a very useful discussion, I think clearly the term current service value causes problems in terms of the service element. So I think the proposal will be that we go with current use value, that we maintain service of an asset, but we need further definition, description, discussion. So we need staff to come back with recommendations on changes on that to get the clarity. We need staff to go through then, based on the discussion that the board's had, and get consistency throughout the discussion, because we do have a variety of different things, or different approaches. So we need to try and get that, that consistency through, particularly the application guidance, I think is where the problems emerge, but probably elsewhere in the core text and the VCs. We've got the additional piece of work that will be to think for how far we can go towards being clear about the issues that members have raised in terms of the approach and thinking about the valuation without getting into the standards. And we clearly, at the moment, the hypothesis is we can go further on that. Dave, anything else you think you're looking for instruction for on this?
No, the last point I had was clarify service potential and potentially define it, but you might have mentioned that.
Yeah, so I think at the moment we're keeping that, but basically we need to define that and make it or describe it however, whatever is appropriate based on what we've got elsewhere, because it is a term that we've used throughout our literature, but we need to be clear here, because I think that was causing problems, you know, and it's also the jump off point for a lot of the discussion that we have later on modern equivalent asset and so on. Okay, so Dave, I'm conscious at some stage we need to bottom out the question about income approach as a measurement technique. Do you want to do that now, or do we defer that to later?
I guess maybe I could explain it a little differently, and maybe that helps. I guess I suggest, Ian, maybe you let staff bring back the updated wording, and maybe that helps members as well.
I mean, I think we do have a difference of views between Lynn and Todd on this, and I think, you know, the question here is how we take this forward. Really, in thinking about this, I suspect, you know, if we, you know, you just make your input, I'll allow Lynn and Todd just to state their case. And then I'll propose perhaps a way forward on that. Okay.
So then the only clarification I'd like to make is, regardless of what measurement technique you apply, in concept, you should always come up with the same value. So if your current use value is X, regardless of whether you use the market approach, income approach, or cost approach, you should always come up with X. They're just different ways of coming up with X. So I guess I just wanted to push back against coming up with a different value using the income approach. It should be approached to apply to estimate that X value. That was the only clarification I wanted to make, and I'm happy for Lynn and Todd to make their points.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. I'm reminded of doing my professional exams and valuing equities, and there were 5 different approaches, and they all seem to end up with different values by different, whether you use PE ratios and all that kind of thing. Anyway, sorry, that's a digression. So perhaps go to Todd first, and then to Lynn, just in terms of you know, because I know Todd, you've got a specific view on this.
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to, if what we're trying to do here is place the service potential of the asset. So we're trying to come up with a value for the asset and to replace the service potential. In my mind, to do that, you have to incur some costs to put in place an asset that is going to essentially do the same sort of job. And so I don't know how the cash flows that are associated with an asset help you determining what it's going to cost you to actually replace the asset or the service potential you need from the asset. So in my mind, a cash flow approach, income approach, it's only going to be coincidental that it might be the number that you would need to replace that service potential. So I can see how a market approach might work. So if you've got an asset that you're using that, you know, is traded in the market, and, you know, in terms of its use, you're using it to its fullest capacity or whatever, you go to the market and that will be the best number in terms of being able to replace the service potential of an asset. I can see how you can build up the amount through replacing an asset that isn't in a market. So replacing, I don't know, a school. So you don't tend to trade in schools. So to replace the school, you would go and you'd buy the piece of land and you would build the school. Okay, you're going to have to take into account the age of the school, so some sort of depreciation. So it's essentially a depreciated replacement cost. But you can build that up that way. How can you use cash flows? And remember, we're dealing with public sector assets, so cash flows are probably not going to be the predominant feature of public sector assets. They tend to be more in the private sector. So that's why I think an income approach it's only going to be coincidental that you're going to come up with the amount that you would need to replace the service potential of the asset. So that's why I have real reservations about an income approach, because I think it would only be coincidental that it would give you the right number.
Okay, thanks, Todd. That was the case for the prosecution, I think. Lynn, if you want to come back, and then I'll take Patricia after that.
So maybe we just need the debate around the fact that there is a evaluation technique out there called existing use value in social housing that is used in a quite widespread way and understood by the valuation community, that is a discounted cash flow technique that they would argue measures the service potential of social housing assets. Now, again, I'm no valuation expert, and maybe it's something for David and Dave to take back to the task force. But what does strike me with existing use value in social housing, which is a discounted cash flow current value measurement, is you've got assets there that probably you only end up building with some form of grant subsidy, because actually you are never going to necessarily recover the cost of the building with the income flow, because you're accepting a lower rental income stream than the market. You're accepting a sub-market rental stream. So I worry that if you make social housing assets the replacement cost and you don't take into account that they've got a grant subsidy, you'll end up overvaluing those assets compared to their existing use value in social housing, which is a discounted cash flow technique that I would argue represents their service potential as social housing at sub-market rental levels. So I guess it was that practical example to my mind that made me come back to saying, well, why wouldn't an income approach be okay?
Okay, thanks, Lynn. So I think, this is
so in your example, is the grant...
Can I take some other... We can spend a lot of time...
Do you understand the example?
Can we just... Because I think ultimately, look, what I'm going to propose on this is a debate about measurement techniques, right? Now, we've agreed that we need a basis. This is a technique that we have a difference of views in the board on. What I would propose is that actually we need to expose this for comment. And I would propose that we ask a specific matter for comment about the use of this measurement technique, and ask for our constituents to come back with evidence, because if they don't support it, then we can actually take it out. But at this stage, I think we could spend a lot of time trying to convince each other about whether this is right or whether this is not right. And I don't think it's really going to help our constituents that we spend another 6 months battling this one out. So my proposal would be that we are consistent with the fact that if we include it, we can use it if it's supported. If it's not supported, then we can take it out. And I think we can expose the 2 points of view that we have within the within the basis for conclusions, because there are two approaches here, and then people can comment. So I'd rather actually take that approach now rather than try and slug it out. And I see support for that. So I think, if I can have comments on if we can go forward with that approach, that's probably the pragmatic way forward on this one at the moment. So I'll take comments then from Patricia and from Lindy.
Yes, in relation to the approach, I think it's connect with the characteristics of assets, because if it's a specific for a specific objective of the public sector entity, probably it's so hard to identify cash flow that's not the cash flow to supplier would pay to supplier in the case. If it focus on the service potential, replacement of service potential, the service potential is linked to where the market or where the negotiation, how to negotiate the assets with the supplier. And for me, it's only a cash flow that I could imagine in the context of a specific assets is, for public sector is cash flow to supplier. Then I think it's not necessary to use the income, because for identify the cash flow that entity you pay to supply, it's necessary to identify the cost of the assets or components of the assets, because these I think is not necessary. But I agree with can consultate the constituent and decide about this.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. I'll take brief comments from Lindy and Mike, and then I'm going to sum up and I'm going to move us on because we need to move on. Lindy and then Mike.
Thank you, and let me be brief. I don't agree that it should be included. It wasn't part of what we envisaged for this approach in the ED that we issued initially. We only had the market approach and the cost approach. And then I would rather say, ask if there's another technique that you can use. I think, again, we're measuring the asset and not the services produced by the assets. I don't think you would apply it, but yeah, that's just my comment. I would ask if you want to include it rather than include it.
Well, I think for clarity, if we include it, we can take it out. If we don't include it, we can't put it in. So I think that's the reason for suggesting the way we go about it, and then our constituents can tell us we can take out what we can't add in. Mike.
Yeah, I think to add to what you're saying, I think we need to be clear about what we're exposing. Are we exposing that the income approach is in or is it not in? If we have a BC that says there's another option, or we ask for an SMC, I don't mind, but we need to be clear about what we're exposing. It's one or the other. We can't sort of expose both.
Thanks, Mike. So, I mean, to be clear, what we can do is we can put in the fact that the income approaches would be acceptable as measurement techniques, but to ask a specific matter for comment on, do you agree with that? Now, we can explain the difference in views within the basis for conclusions, and we can, you know, so that we've got absolute clarity on this. And you know, I think we need to leave it for staff to go away and just actually construct the appropriate drafting on this. So I think this is back to Dave and also to Ross to get this right, because we clearly do have a disagreement on this, but it's a disagreement on a measurement technique. Let's be clear. It's not about the overall approach. We've got a way forward on the, let's call it current use value. So it, you know, I think we need to get the overall approach. My suggestion would be that in bringing this back, Dave, I think, you know, consistent with Ross's advice on what text needs to be where to get this articulated and to get the specific matter for comment drafted right, that you work with both Lynn and Todd just to get the arguments one way or the other, and then we can use that. Dave, Ross, can I confirm whether you understand what we've asked for, and probably Ross in particular, that works in due process terms?
Yeah, I think that does work. From my observation of the discussions we've just had and the drafting that's already in the ED, we've already said that income approach would be very limited. So I think it's about flushing out the arguments to pick up the point that Lynn's made on, I think she called it existing use value in the valuation community. In these limited circumstances, we can envision it would be used. And then we have an SMC pointing to that in detail, so people are clear that we're not putting this in as a broadly applied group of measurement techniques, and that we do think it'd be an extremely rare case. And do constituents agree with that, yes or no? And then they can tell us. I agree from a due process perspective. I like the idea of leaving it in to take it out, because I think it's more challenging if we get a bunch of people saying, well, here's 5 or 6 limited circumstances we think it'd apply, and we haven't articulated that in our ED. That might set us up for a need to re-expose. I think if It doesn't always mean you'd have to re-expose, but I think it's an easier argument to take something out that was there that people have seen you work through.
Thanks, Ross. And then we specifically will get input from constituents, which we can use and then take the final decision. Okay, so Dave, then anything else you need on current use value?
No, I think we're ready to move to value in use.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so in terms of the discussion on value in use, I'll go to John in a minute. I think we need to break the discussion down into the steps that John has identified in the paper. So, you know, I want to focus on within ED 77 or not, do we provide guidance? Then the question about how we deal with this from a conceptual framework point of view. So I want to focus the discussions on those. So John, if you can introduce us the recommendation on how we approach it in the from the point of view of ED 77.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and hello everybody. This flows from the direction at the meeting on the 27th of October, where, if you recall, the recommendation then was that value in use just be defined in a cash generating context. The board said they wanted more work done, and that is why we've evolved the steps that Ian noted. So the recommendations are that because value in use is limited to impairment and the topic is addressed in detail in 2 IPSAS, that's IPSAS 21 for non-cash generating assets and IPSAS 26 for cash generating assets, that we should not include detailed guidance, we should not include guidance, full stop, on value in use in ED 77. Okay, so that's number 1. Value.
Okay. Can we just
there, Ian, and
debate?
Yeah,
we can stop there, and I just want to check where the board is on that. So if you stop sharing your screen, and then I just want to check whether we've got any disagreement with that recommendation before we move on to the approach and the conceptual framework. Yeah, Mike.
So thank you, Chair, and thank you, John. I suppose I'm comfortable, John, that it's not defined or described in ED 77, as you've mentioned, but I think it should be described or defined somewhere. I think the conceptual framework should continue to define value in use. Why wouldn't you? It's there. It's a term we all use, and it needs to be defined.
Can we come back to the conceptual framework in a minute? I just want to get the decision about whether we're happy to exclude it from ED 77 at the moment. That's
the next item, Mike. We will.
Ross, you wanted to come in?
Just one point of clarity on that, Mike. I think it is already described in both IPSAS 21 and 26 as well. So, I mean, not including it in 77 isn't kicking the can down the road. It's there and it's being used and it's been there for a long time. So I don't think we should lose that point in the discussion.
Okay, so I think I'm not seeing any other flags up, so I think we're content that we're not using it in 77. Lynn?
Sorry, I was just going to make the point, but I do think it is in ED 77 that ED 77 should recognise there are other techniques that might kick in other standards, which I think it does.
Sorry, so you're saying?
I'm happy that I'm happy with the recommendation. When we get to looking at ED 77, it's important that ED 77 somewhere cross refers to, if you're in the impairment standards, you might be using different measurement bases and techniques, which I think it does, but it's worth us just checking that when we get there.
Okay, so we just need to check the wording makes it clear on that. Okay, thanks. Right, John, take us back into the conceptual framework now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the recommendation for the conceptual framework is that we should not define value in use in the conceptual framework.
You're sharing your inbox. Oh, sorry, it's Dave's inbox at the moment. Right, okay.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks, Dave. Appreciated. And we should not include value in use as a measurement basis in the hierarchy diagram. So there will be a description rather than a definition. Okay, I hope that's clear. So no definition, a description, and value in use does not appear in level 2 of the hierarchy diagram. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks, John. So just the other point that we need to bear in mind here is the fact that we are in somewhat of a mess, if I use the technical term, in terms of definitions between what we've got in IPSAS 21 and 26, how the ISB has defined it in their conceptual framework, and what we have in our conceptual framework, and the fact that we have inconsistencies between what's in our framework and what's in 21 and 26. So we have a hodgepodge of stuff at the moment. So we need to bear that in mind in where we go on this. And we may be content to live with that, or we might want to do something about it. So with that, I open the floor. Mike, you're first in line, and then Camira.
Thanks, Chair. So I suppose I'm struggling to understand what's the description as against what's the definition. I prefer if it was defined, and let's have one definition. And if that means we've got to do a limited scope review of 21, then let's do a limited scope review.
Right.
Okay.
Should I come back on that, Ian, or do you want to?
Can I just take a round of comments?
Yes.
And also, but just to be clear though, Mike, the limited scope review would not be now. So the question is what we do now in the framework without committing ourselves to further widespread work at this stage. Camira.
Thanks, Chair. Well, I agree with the recommendation in part of the staff of not including, like in the hierarchy, the value in use, and also not including it in the ED 77. But in terms of the staff presented two alternatives. The first alternative was, okay, just to accept that there are inconsistencies and also between the private sector framework and then the alternative B of removing the definition and just leaving it with a short description of value in use. I will agree more with the first alternative of living with the inconsistencies, because we do have reasons for departing from the private sector. The first reason is that we have a specific standard for non-cash generating assets, and that's enough reason already for supporting why our definition of value in use is different from that in the private sector. So from that point of view, I will, if we would need to agree with the recommendation of staff of replacing it with the definition with the description, before agreeing with that, I would like to see which description then we would provide then in that case. So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. So you're supporting the first option by staff, which is we leave what we've got at the moment in the framework. Okay. Any other comments? And then I think I might just take a show of hands at that stage on which option members support. Okay, so I mean, John set out two approaches in the document. One, we just leave it as is, and the other that we move to a description which at least addresses in the short term some of the inconsistencies that we've got. Mike, and I'm just going to take a show of hands, option 1 versus option 2.
So sorry to go on about this, Chair, but I'm happy to support what John's proposing, but maybe it needs something in the basis of conclusions while we've done what we've done.
That would be taken as read. Yes, sorry, Mike. Yeah. Okay, so can I just take a show of hands from members to find out where we are on this? So just to be clear, first one, and I'll ask for a show of hands, will be on we leave what's in the current version of the conceptual framework and we accept that we have inconsistencies. The second is that we remove the definition and that we have a description which removes the conflicts in definitions, bearing in mind we have specific and separate definitions in 21 and 26. Under either scenario, we would need to describe what the board has actually decided and why in basis for conclusions. Everyone clear on those two options? So can I have a show of hands in favour of retaining what we have in the current conceptual framework? So that's Camira and Todd. Those in favour of the staff proposal? So I think that's a majority in favour. Sorry, can you just keep your hands up for Ross to?
I've got 11 for that option.
And 2 against. Anybody abstain? Ajith, you're abstaining? Or you want to come in? So we've got, I mean, we have 16 members present. We've got.
I'm not abstaining. I actually voted for the second option.
Okay.
Right.
So, Mike, I mean, I think on the basis of that, we have support for staff proposal from the requisite number of board members. Mike?
Yeah, and I supported for that, Ian, but I just wanted then, does it also need an SMC?
Yeah, there.
Absolutely.
Say there is an SMC, which we'll look at tomorrow, Mike. So that is in agenda item 4. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for that, everyone. So John, then the final legs of the recommendation, I think, are what we do going forwards.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry for the slight delay.
So, I mean,
yeah. So the third recommendation is that there's 2 different standard specific definitions of value in use in IPSAS 21 for non-cash generating context, IPSAS 26 for the cash generating context. So the recommendation is that there's no immediate need to modify either standard. And Ian, if I may, I think we can couple that with the 4th recommendation that we should consider whether to propose a limited scope project on IPSAS 21 in the next mid-period work programme consultation. Now, the reason why that project would be limited to IPSAS 21 is that staff don't see any need to modify IPSAS 26. IPSAS 26 is consistent both with the current definition and what will be the description in the framework. It's also consistent, subject to minor terminology, with the IASB conceptual framework, and it's fully consistent with IAS 36, the IAS standard on impairment. So just to summarize again, no immediate proposal to modify either standard, no consequential coming out of ED 77. That flows from the fact that we're not going to discuss impairment in ED 77 apart from the reference that Lynn's proposed and a proposal for a limited scope project on IPSAS 21 at next work programme. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. So I don't propose to discuss the final leg of this at this stage. I think it factors in with our discussions on the work programme later on in the week. But does anybody disagree with staff's third proposal that no immediate modification to either 21 or 26? Okay, so I think we're good with that recommendation. So with that, we move on, Dave, to restrictions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John.
So with regards to restrictions, I'll give a little background on how the task force discussed this issue. The reason this item came up, in two regards. The first one was at the October meeting, or I think it was the October meeting, members asked how restrictions should be taken into account as they relate to heritage items. Because measurement staff was already going to look at restrictions as a result of comments from constituents asking us to look at thoughts provided by other national standard setters. Staff from the measurement team took on this restrictions issue and took it to the measurement task force. Now, when we took it to the measurement task force, we used the term restrictions, and that's partly because that's the genesis of this issue. But we did start using different terms when we discussed it with the measurement task force. So what we did at the measurement task force is we identified two types of restrictions. The first were external restrictions. And we thought these related to legal restrictions for the most part. So this might be where a piece of land has a zoning restriction on it. So it's zoned as residential property or commercial property or industrial property. And this was an external restriction because if the asset was sold to another party, that zoning was sold with the asset, and the party that assumed or owned the asset would also have to comply with that restriction. The task force fairly quickly agreed that those should be included in the valuation of current service value, and they thought that, and that's consistent with a fair value measurement as well. The second type of restriction that was identified was an internal restriction. Now, we didn't use the term internal restrictions for very long. We discussed more from the perspective of the task force said these internal restrictions sounded more like social policy objectives of the entity. So while I was coming at from the perspective of these were restrictions that the entity had placed on itself, like I said, the task force saw this more as the entity's overall operating objective, and these were that's the lens they took when considering these types of restrictions. An example that we talked through to provide some light on this goes back to the example we have in the standard where a school has a capacity of 500 students, but for social policy reasons, maybe the municipality wants to target a certain demographic. They're only going to allow 400 students into the school that will be taught at that location. From my experience, growing up in Western Canada, we've got some French language schools and English language schools. In Western Canada, French language schools aren't as popular, so the capacity isn't as high, but that's a social policy decision of the municipality to have those schools. And even though the capacity won't be at full capacity, they want to make sure that the French language continues to be used throughout Canada and Western Canada especially. So going back to this, where the task force landed was that when measuring current service value, you should take into account the social policy objective when measuring the value of the asset. And this comes back to staff's view and their view that when reflecting this information to users of the financial statement, if you were going to replace the service provided by that asset, you would only replace it with an asset that can provide teaching to 400 students instead of 500. Now, subsequent to this paper coming out, we've talked to some members who have proposed an alternative view. And I'd say the view is that your choice of social policy doesn't impact the value of the asset. So in this regard, you should value the asset at the 500 students, not the 400 students. I think this is an important discussion for the IPSASB to have, because I think it kind of gets to the core of current service value and what the IPSASB wants current service value to reflect to users of the financial statements. Like I said, I think if you only value the school at 400 students, that reflects the cost to replace the asset as it's currently being used. I think there is very important informational value when you value the school at the 500 students. This reflects the capacity difference in the 400 and 500 students and shows users that either there's excess capacity or the school is being used inefficiently. So I still put forward staff's view, but I do think both views are valid, and it really comes down to what the IPSASB wants to reflect in current service value.
Thanks, Dave. So open up for comments from members on this. So I've got Patricia, and then Chris, then Mike.
Thank you. I agree with the recommendation, but not with the argument in paragraph, because the discussion about the potential service of assets or potential or service provided. I think it needed to it needs to be coherent with the definition. The change in the definition you reflect in this case too.
Thanks, Patricia. So Chris, then Mike, then Todd.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is to support the option of the staff with an example, practical example, in my country where there's a policy of government to restrict admission of students into an educational institution because of their peculiar circumstance. I'm talking about the nomadic educational policy in Nigeria. Irrespective of the capacity of the school, the admission is restricted to only that class of students, and there are not too many in particular locations, but they just must be educated. So I'm just supporting what Dave has said, that there is a practical example in different jurisdictions, not just the Canada that he has cited.
Thanks, Chris. That's helpful. Always good to have examples. Mike, then Todd, then Bernard.
Thanks, Chair. So it's hard not to disagree with the recommendation, but I'm just worried about the consequences of the recommendation. So if we, and maybe it's my use of the word restrictions as against yours, Dave, but if the restriction results or the recommendation results in the valuation of the asset being reduced for some reason, and that may then be lower than replacement cost or current service value, then I think we're understating the carrying value of the asset, and we therefore understate the profit and loss impact of depreciation. So it's the implications of what you're saying that I'm worried about. I don't think that in the public sector, a restriction means we have to reduce the value or the service potential of the asset. And that's what worries me with your example of the social policy situation. I preferred your example of the hospital. If a hospital is built in the middle of Sydney and there's zoning restrictions that says the asset's always going to be used for a hospital, I wouldn't be accepting a write down in the carrying value of the asset, because that has all sorts of consequences, I think. So I'm just worried about how you use the recommendation you're making.
Thanks, Mike. So Todd, then Bernard.
Thanks, Ian. I think I'd share your concerns, Mike. I think for self-imposed restrictions, generally, I wouldn't expect that to affect the current service value or current use value or whatever term we've landed on. But But coming to the point of, the current use value, and you may not be using, the 500 capacity school to its maximum, you might only have, 400 students in it. I don't think we should be valuing the asset based purely on the number of students that are using it on the day of the measurement, because school roles can fluctuate. They go up and down. And I think, in my mind, in valuing the service potential of the school, you need to look not only at the number of students that might be there today, but think about the foreseeable future as well, because this is about the amount to replace, I think, the asset. So if, in thinking about it in a longer term scenario, you would still build a 500 student school, then I think that's what we want to be measuring in terms of the current service or current use value, because you would be wanting to replace service potential for 500 students essentially. So there are some things to think through, I think, in this area in terms of what you've called restrictions. And as I say, I don't think self-imposed type restrictions or the current use of it is necessarily going to result in a lower value. So supporting Mike.
Thanks, Todd. So I've got Bernard, Lindy, Lynn, and then I'll go to David to sort of wrap up and decide how we move forward. Okay, so Bernard, and then Lindy, and then Lynn.
Thank you, Ian. I think this is an incredibly interesting debate, to be honest. I think it's very necessary. What kind of always helps me when we come to a point like this, actually, is to try to get it also in a chronological order, in that kind of sense. So if we build a school of 500 for 500 pupils with the expectation that they will come, right? Then in initial recognition, initial measurement, we're going to value the school with the 500. But over the long term, actually, you might have to ask yourself, and that's what the impairment standards come in, on actually whether there's any achievable way to really have 500 pupils at the school. So if your policy restrictions are kind of prohibiting you from using the asset to full capacity, then you're going to go into the impairment at some point in time. And I think the impairment standard allows for the long-term strategy. It doesn't have to be 1 year you are below the 500 and you have to immediately write it down, right? You have to come up with a plan on how to come back to the 500. Or you can try to figure out the different use of parts of the building. You don't have to do it necessarily at the same day where you discover that you have some plus space in that area. So I think if we kind of try to connect it to the whole universe we are having on the standards, I think it's we do have a lot of guidance around that.
Thanks, Bernard. I certainly think that may be part of the key to the way through it, that actually we're not quite using the right example here, that it may well be the kind of need for a hospital in a particular inner city site rather than that. And I think your suggestion there in terms of the use of the impairment standards is probably relevant. But I'll take comments then from Lindy, Lynn, and then David, final comment.
Thank you. And my point was going to be exactly what Bernard said. We need to be careful that we're not valuing something that we're going to impair. And I don't think it means we need to change the impairment standard. I think we need to be clear that we are valuing the current service potential, which already acknowledges, or we've proposed acknowledges, that you may have to have spare capacity because of a long-term view. But if you have excess capacity, which you're never going to use, you don't include it in the valuation, because we want to also move away from, kind of building this highest and best use concept in valuing the service potential and looking at what is the potential service potential we can derive from it. I think there must be limits in terms of what we are doing with this basis. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindy. And I saw a lot of support coming in for your comments there. Lynn, and then to David.
So I think my points are similar to what Bernard and Lindy have said. I think we need to be careful not to mix up too many things and try to solve too many things in one measurement here. So when I read the paper, like Mike, I was content with the paper and the recommendation, but the consequence as just described made me then feel nervous, because the school, I've got a school that serves 500. Surely my first point of call is, well, I then value a school that serves 500. I then consider if I've got an impairment trigger that says, I don't need a school that's 500, I need a school that's 400. That could be a trigger for impairment. That's a different then discussion and place that I go to. But similarly, and I think sometimes we mix up and use restrictions in too many circumstances. The example you were giving in of an inner city hospital, if I've got an inner city hospital and I have no choice but to have a hospital in the middle of a city centre, I have to replace the service potential of a hospital in the city centre, not a hospital on the outskirts, but a hospital in the city centre. And we shouldn't mix the two things up, and I think we are in the conversation a little bit.
Thanks, Lynn. And again, I see support from members for that comment. So, David, to you from a task force perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, Lynn's point is exactly right. I mean, there are the term restriction can be used in too many ways. I mean, the evaluation community in their standard, under their real property valuation standard, actually says, now this again goes back to the point that, you know, the accountant as the instructing side of the equation here needs to understand what they're instructing, but the valuers, to comply with the requirements to state the extent of the investigation and the nature and the source of the information to be relied upon, has to consider certain matters, and one of them is the legal permissions or restrictions on the use of the property and any buildings, as well as any expected or potential changes to legal permissions or restrictions. So the valuation profession will take into account those type of restrictions. Now, normally, as Dave mentioned in his introduction, those tend to be around land. They tend to be around, you can't use this land for anything other than either residential or commercial or parkland or something like that. And often that is enshrined in statute or in other legal documents. And I think the valuers would always take that into consideration. I mean, I think the point that is more difficult is the point that Lynn was making, and that is where if you've got something like a hospital that is in the centre of a city and you need to have that hospital there, you don't want it 25 miles away on the outskirts of some huge conurbation. That is something that as Lynn said, you're going to need to replace that service potential in that location. But that is not an externally, well, normally wouldn't be an externally imposed legal restriction or permission. It's what, as Dave said, what the task force considered to be a social policy decision. It's, you know, for reasons of demographics or whatever, but it's something that is there because it's needed by your citizens in that particular place. And it's the question then that's what we want to value. And that's what we need to make clear. And again, it goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier, because the valuer would normally not think about that. If you need a hospital that serves 1,000 people, they would look around to see where that would be most cost efficient to put it. But what you as the accountant or the instructing officer needs to say is, no, you can't look around for somewhere to put it. We need it there. And I think that's what we need to get across as you know, the various things that you need to consider. So I think, excuse me, we'll need to think about the wording. But on the, just picking up on the expected usage, there is in Appendix B, paragraph B6, we have actually put something in about, so it's not that it's 500 pupils today, but it might be 550 tomorrow, and then, you know, 600 the next week. You're actually looking at your expected usage in the medium term, probably.
Okay, thanks, David. Mindful of time, I think where we get to is we probably do need something in the ED that actually picks up on the term restrictions as it would be used by the valuers, to acknowledge that perspective. But I think where we do need some further proposals is to capture the sense of the discussions that we've just had, that this is not about use of the impairment standards, it's actually about this social policy and what does that mean in valuation terms, and we need to get that clarity. So I think that's, you know, if you like, it's our first probably proper subject too, that we need some further recommendations on specifically how do we address that. I think there's been a fairly good degree of agreement amongst members that that's what's required, that it's not the impairment side of things. We can obviously reference that, but we need further advice back on how we should address this issue about the sort of hospital in a particular location type of issue, rather than what was presented. So it's a social policy context. Okay, so I think that would be a request that comes back then when we look at this again. So we'll need specific material on this to make sure that we are happy with the revised proposal and the revised drafting. So I'm going to wrap up at that point. So apologies, Mike and Todd, but I think we're now at 2:10, so we do need to. Sorry, it's 2:10 in the UK, not elsewhere. 10 past the hour. It is, so I think we need to break at this point in time, and probably actually, Mike and Todd, we need to let you get to bed. But I think, so if we have that as a way forward, that is a clear subject too, that we need some further advice back on that when we see the next draft on this. I'll wrap up there for today. We will then carry on tomorrow when we come back, and we will clear off the remaining issues on ED 77 and walk through the drafting, and then we'll move on to the conceptual framework at that point in time. So thanks very much, everyone. I think we've moved us forward on a number of tricky issues, some good discussions. I think with that, I'll close the session today. Look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow, rested and refreshed, hopefully. So thanks very much. See you tomorrow.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.